listening to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Good evening and welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Talia Bettcher. This evening I will not be accompanied by my regular co-hosts Rick Lee and Lee Johnson. Sadly, I'm all by myself. I'm not in a bar. I'm in my room. The lights are down low. Some candles lit. There's some melancholic music playing in the background. So what we normally do is we take a brief break, and during that break, we play reruns of some of our greatest hits. But this time around, we wanted to do something a little bit different. What we thought would be interesting is this idea of the MINIBAR. Each one of us three is taking on a topic by ourselves for a much briefer period of time and trying to dig into it. You've already had this experience because you've already will have heard Lee's MINIBAR and Rick's MINIBAR, both of which are awesome, by the way. So if you haven't, you should check them out. This evening, I guess I want to do things a little bit different. As I said, I'm in a bit of a mood, and I'm so used to doing barstool confessions. I guess I want to start with that. There's something fairly serious that I really have not been talking about on the Hotel Bar Sessions podcast, and that is, towards the end of June, I was diagnosed with kidney cancer, renal cell carcinoma. I think I didn't really announce it publicly as a barstool confession because it's not particularly funny. And I try my best to actually do a humorous confession. So here we are. One of the things that I think I really want to try to do in the brief time that we have is simply talk about my experience. First of all, being diagnosed with renal cell carcinoma, the various psychological, emotional things that I went through, and the philosophical issues that they raised. And I also want to talk about the surgery that I recently completed a little over a week ago, a robotic surgery in which a portion of my left kidney was removed, the tumor was removed, and this is called a partial nephrectomy. So I'm thinking about dividing our discussion this evening into three parts. In the first part, I want to talk about getting the news and the sorts of issues that raised for me. And then I want to talk about the anticipation and what it was like when I finally got the diagnosis nailed down, because at first I wasn't clear what stage it was. Finally, I want to talk about the surgical process and what it was like to go through that. So today is going to be a little bit more intimate, I suppose, and it's going to be very real. I mean, for me, philosophy is very closely connected to a life lived, and really being connected to philosophizing my way through life. And for most of these decades, my philosophy has very much attended to transness and the experience of transness. But this time around, it's going to be a little bit different because I'll be talking about, I think, more existential issues, or rather existential issues are not inflected in the way in which I've tended to think about them. So my GP called me with MRI results. I guess it was on a Friday. So he'd had me do an MRI because there had already been a CAT scan, and the CAT scan had shown a cystic mass. The results of the cystic mass were such that the folks who had written the report were saying, oh, we don't think any kind of follow-up is necessary. But my GP also knew that I had been a smoker, that I had a history of smoking, and so thankfully said, no, I think you should go for an MRI too. Originally, I had been having kidney pains that wouldn't go away, and that's what originally brought me in to talk to my doctor. So I did the MRI, and when my doctor called me and told me, look, they found a tumor underneath the cystic mass, and it has been categorized as Bosniak 4. It's not an actual diagnosis. It's something that the imaging folks use to determine what they think they're seeing and the likelihood is. And what Bosniak 4 meant for me was that there was a 90% chance that what they had identified was cancerous. And so my GP recommended, of course, that I schedule an appointment with an oncologist immediately. Okay, so I now have this period of a weekend because I quickly went ahead and scheduled an appointment. I didn't waste any time. I found an oncologist and scheduled that appointment ASAP. So there was this weekend, however, where I had to sit with everything. And I really felt that I needed to do this alone. And so I told my boyfriend not to come over. I wanted to be by myself. I wanted to be alone. And this really led to what was a long, dark night of the soul. What ended up happening is that I ended up doing my own internet sleuthing, as of course I would. And based on the report that they had given me, it appeared that the tumor, which was already very big, it was 6 by 6 by 8.7 centimeters, so a big honking thing that kind of wrapped around the left kidney, had grown all the way to what is known as the Gerota's fascia, which is a sac that contains a portion of the kidney and the adrenal gland, as I understand it. And the idea is if it reaches the Gerota's fascia, then it's moving out of local cancer and moving into a more widespread cancer, which is bad. And so at this point, I had, as it were, diagnosed myself with stage 3 renal cancer. I then made the mistake of putting this into the computer, into ChatGPT. I basically wrote out the MRI summary verbatim and put it in there. And lo and behold, it kept coming back time and again with stage 4. So, stage 3, stage 4, although the prognoses are much better than a long time ago, I was filled with dread. The prospect of facing my much sooner death really, really loomed large for me. And over that weekend, I grappled a lot with it. It was really all I could think of course. And that confrontation of it went really, really deep. I have this relationship, as perhaps many of us do, to this, say, concept, experience, anticipation of utter oblivion, terminal non-existence, because not only when I'm thinking about our own little personal oblivion do we cease to exist, the thought is that we're not coming back, so there's not going to be a subsequent resurrection. There's no, as it were, metaphysical gappy existence. We're just gone and that's it. And of course, when you really think about that, it can be, from a subjective point of view, quite dread-filling, in part because it is in fact so hard to even fathom, if indeed it is fathomable. As a kid, I was always plagued by these difficult concepts. I remember when I was very young, first being tortured by the concept of infinity. And I had a dream about that was relayed to me through the Count from Sesame Street. What the Count would do is count up to 10, 20, and so forth. But at one point, the Count would say infinity and laugh. It would just strike absolute terror into me. And so these types of philosophical anticipations or concepts, or however you want to describe them, have, of course, as a philosopher and as a human being, been with me throughout my life. I would say that towards my mid-20s, I really, really began to be tortured by the concept, the anticipation of oblivion. I just couldn't let it go. It consumed me, and I was having dreams about it. Perhaps not surprisingly, it was right around the time coinciding with my own sort of gender clarification and ultimate transition. I had this one dream that I was attached to this life support machine. My parents were standing around, and I had this clear perception that I was fighting death. The siren went off, and I knew that I was about to die, and this wave of numbness was coming up my body from my feet, heading towards the top of my head. And I knew that if it got to the top of my head, that would be it. So I fought it. I tried to hold it back. I, in fact, managed to slow it down. But I also experienced this futility. There was nothing I could do about it. It was, at some point, going to reach the top of my head, and I would cease to exist utterly. Everything that I was and that I had been would be subjectively dissipated. And I was filled with terror. And then in the dream, my father said, "Go with it, you're already dead." And I don't know if that was like piling on or it was meant to be a consolation or what. But then everything went super dark, deep space dark. And I went through this extended period where I didn't know whether or not I even existed. It was this weird anti-Cartesian position where I'm freaking out. I'm wondering to myself, do I exist or have I ceased to exist altogether? And I didn't know. And it took me a long time to fight my way into consciousness, and I feel like this was certainly one of those dreams that never leaves you. And so I've always had this real dread of terminal non-existence, of oblivion. When I was told my diagnosis, and further when I went on anticipating self-diagnosing and even worse, getting ChatGPT to help me out, I really had to confront this. One of the things that I found quite remarkable, I'm not saying that the weekend was easy, but my relationship to terminal non-existence had changed quite a lot. It was no longer the same, and I don't think that I had the same sort of fear of it that I did, even though I still couldn't make sense of it, and even though there was still, of course, quite a horrifying edge to it. And I'm not entirely sure what accounts for the change. Many years had intervened, and of course I've grown older, and I think that as we grow older, it may be the case that our relationship to this also changes. And perhaps we become more used to the idea simply because it's with us longer. But I also think that having lived a life and having gone through some things that were really difficult, and I have to say, maybe I'll talk about this a bit more later on, from around 2012 onwards, my life feels like it has been, not entirely, but a lot, a series of catastrophes. A series of extreme moments that when I report them to other people, they find them jaw-dropping, these experiences, these reported experiences. And I think that I had gone through so much that I felt different about terminal non-existence. But I also think that because I had lived several decades beyond that dream and accomplished things in my life, that I could say, well, look, I'm going to die at some point. It appears that I'm going to die much sooner than I thought. But I do feel like I've accomplished something. And, I've always been a very ambitious person. And while I do feel that I've accomplished a lot, I can't say that it's lived up to my wildest ambitions and dreams. But nonetheless, it's something that I can feel proud of. I feel like I have contributed to the world. It's okay. That's not bad. That's a life that you can be proud of. But I think more importantly is the sense that I know that I had made my life my own, that I had made choices along the way, and that most of the major life choices I made were choices that took me away from the mainstream path, that required that I think through and reject what everyone else thought I should do. I knew at that moment of that long, dark weekend of the soul that I had made my life my own, and that no matter what, nobody could change that. So I felt a sort of peace. And I felt this peace with everything, I think, in part because I also really felt like I had a deep understanding of who and what I was in relationship to the universe. This is, for the better or the worse, who I am. It's what I've done, and there was a real acceptance with it. Now, I don't mean to say that I wanted to go, but for me, a lot of the incentive for staying had to do with obligations to others. I certainly didn't want to die before my parents did. As a parent, I can't think of anything at all worse than losing one's child. And I really, of course, didn't want that to affect my parents. I have a daughter, 2 daughters, in fact, and I really didn't want to go for them either, and many other reasons too. But I really feel like this was, I wouldn't say a turning point, but it was a deep philosophical, spiritual moment for me. I can't say necessarily that I'm grateful for having experienced, but I think maybe I am grateful. What happened was I saw the oncologist after this long, dark weekend of the soul, and he felt that it was, in fact, only stage 2. And the reason he explained to me that it was only stage 2 is that it had not grown into the fascia. It had only grown up to the fascia, and so therefore still remained local. Okay, you want a barstool confession? Here's a confession. life has been throwing me some curves. I thought that after, as I said, a series of relentless catastrophes, that I was finally pulling out of things. And, a couple of years ago, I told myself, okay, finish the book, get a divorce, and get laid. And I accomplished all three of those things. And so I thought I was on my way. But then, who got elected? The beginning of the year, Pasadena and Altadena were afflicted by these horrendous fires, and this is where I live. I myself was unscathed, but many of my friends were scathed, and an entire town that I knew and loved was basically razed to the ground. It was clear that Trump was on a warpath for trans people in a way that was truly jaw-dropping, and I began to debate whether or not I should even stay in the United States anymore. So suddenly what seemed like, okay, I'm on my way to my new life, was not my new life. And every day just getting up was such a heaviness, such a drag, And when I finally reached the point that, okay, I'm going to stay in Los Angeles another year, well, Trump decided to send the National Guard to Los Angeles. And I'm thinking, oh my God, so now we're getting this invasion of Los Angeles. You can't make this stuff up. It's incredible. I was dealing with this when I got hit with the diagnosis. And then, of course, everything completely got thrown off the page. Then I was like, okay, I'm going to make peace with this. I'm going to make peace with the fact that my life on this planet is going to be significantly shorter than I thought. And then suddenly it's like, no, it looks like your outcomes are pretty good. I think that what you need to do is you need to find yourself a surgeon. We'll either do a partial or a radical nephrectomy. You'll be able to move on. And probably, given that it seems like it's local, you're going to be okay. Part of me was like, I don't want to go on anymore. I was almost like terminal non-existence, not that bad. And I know that's a hard confession to make, and people may not like to hear, but it was something that I felt for a little bit. It took me a while to think about, well, why is it I'm feeling this way? Aside from the objectively shitty circumstances that the world now finds itself. And part of it is just feeling absolutely tired of the way that I'm living. And so this did also result in some more self-reflection about how have I been living my life? And is this the way that I want to go on living my life? I drive myself very hard, and I often feel like I carry the weight of, if not the world, a lot of things. I feel a lot of responsibility for things. I feel responsible for trans people and for trans people in the profession. And whether rightly or wrongly, I feel like that's on me and I need to be doing something. And I feel like it sometimes wears on me. And I realize that. I realize also as a dutiful person that I had not been devoting a lot of my existence to seeking out joy. And so one of the things that I worked through in therapy was sort of the importance of this. And it is going to be something that I continue to struggle with over the next coming years. It looks like I've spoken way longer on certain topics than I thought I would, and so I'm not going to talk much at all about the third topic, which was surgical meat. Becoming aware of oneself and one's body as something not human, as something simply just flesh, hamburger, surgical flesh, and the experience of apprehending that, undergoing that, recovering from that. So I'll only allude to that now, and I'll just simply say, I've been recovering over the course of a little more than a week, and the recovery is going very well. And through this time, and I know that it sounds a little bit hallmarky to say, but it's true, that I have really, really found myself to be fortunate, to be loved, and to be held and cared for by so many good people in my life. I'm really extremely grateful for that. I do want to say that maybe here's something else. If apprehending oneself as a kind of surgical meat, as a kind of bodily lump of flesh and tissue, is one way to really apprehend who and what we are, then another way is in fact through moments of intimacy, moments of sharing. And I do think that philosophy is something that can be shared intimately, particularly when it's attached to our lives. And I hope that this was such a moment for you. I know that it was for me. I'm the last of the three of us to go in terms of these MINIBAR sessions. So we're looking forward to the 14th season, and we're looking forward to more exciting, hilarious, and provocative discussions in the season to come. I do want to invite you to consider joining us and becoming a member of our family, becoming a regular at the hotel bar. And you can do that by visiting www.patreon.com/hotel bar sessions. Something like that. You'll figure it out. By supporting us, by helping us deliver to you the kind of programming that we are, and by coming on board, even, just a little bit, will not only help us continue to do what we do, but also perhaps help you feel like you're really a tight member of our family. Anyway, it's been a pleasure speaking with you this evening, and I'll see you in season 14.